I'm Bertram de Souza, host of the Scribbler Publishing Group video podcast and retired editorial page editor and Sunday columnist of the now defunct Youngstown Vindicator. Our segment today highlights the 15-episode audio podcast titled Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio, that was financed by Sony and produced by nationally renowned documentary maker Marc Smerling of New York City. The documentary has taken the nation and indeed the world by storm. The Crooked City series explores the Mahoning Valley's long romance with the Mafia and its putrid history of public corruption, and parallels much of the content of my book, No Holds Barred, that includes chapters on La Cosa Nostra and the late Congressman turned federal prisoner James A. Traficant Jr. The admonition that evil prevails when good people do nothing is illustrated in stark reality by the episodes. A new one is streamed on Apple Podcasts each Monday. To date, there have been 4. The title, Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio, may well rub many Valley residents the wrong way, but we cannot and should not turn a blind eye to the lessons of history. My co-host, Cynthia Rickard, a former Youngstown Vindicator editor, and I are pleased that Marc Smerling is joining us today via Zoom. He, along with members of his production team, visit this region many times, researching and interviewing some of the Mahoning Valley's more infamous residents. Also joining us will be David Beatrice, a leading criminal defense lawyer in the state and former chairman of the Mahoning County Democratic Party. David has watched all 15 episodes. He purchased them from the online app The Binge and is a huge fan. He jumped at the chance to chat with Marc. First of all, thank you, Marc, for joining us. Nice to see you again. Congratulations on the release of Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio podcast.
Thank you.
And the national and global success. It's a fascinating, I've watched 4 episodes. They're dropped every Monday. And we will be joined by somebody who watched all 15 and wants to talk to you about it. So this is my co-host, Cynthia Rickard. Cindy is a veteran journalist, had been with the Youngstown Vindicator for 41 years, and was the editor of my book, No Holds Barred, which is dedicated to the now defunct newspaper. To begin with, let's tell us about yourself, your background, your personal and professional, because the more people watch this, that's the one question is, who is this Marc Smerling, and what's his interest in Youngstown, Ohio? So if you wouldn't mind giving us that.
I will, but I'm sort of the least important part of the story, to be honest. But basically, I started out in film. I made documentaries with another guy by the name of Andrew Jarecki back in the day. We made a film called Capturing the Freedmans that got nominated. Okay. And then, we made The Jinx. We made Catfish and Catfish, the TV show. And I got attracted to podcasts after The Jinx because because it was so liberating to work in audio. Mm-hmm. I could spend more time reporting, which is, I think the backbone of all good storytelling at some level. And those times were challenging to find in television, which was a sort of speeding up, especially in the crime part of television. And I just love podcasts. I'm a This American Life fan, and I just always thought that was a great way to tell stories. So I took a crack at it. That was Crimetown, Providence, mm-hmm. Which was one of the top podcasts. I think probably one of the top podcasts of all time. Very similar in a way. It's a sort of look at a city on multiple levels with multiple characters, crossing from crime to corruption. And then I edited the Ballad of Billy Balls, which was another top podcast, and RFK tapes. We did a second season of Crimetown in Detroit with Kwame Kilpatrick. And then when we decided that the name of the show we were going to make was going to be Crimetown, I did a Google search, and of course, David Grann's article came up.
Right.
And I read it. I thought, oh, wow, we have a 3rd season. But unfortunately, our deal with Spotify didn't renew. And, and I went off to make a couple other TV series, Wilderness Fair and now Mind Over Murder. And then I partnered with Sony Music And Crooked City was born, and I got a chance to look at Youngstown, Ohio.
What's your background?
Yeah.
Are you a filmmaker? Are you a journalist? Give us some insight into your background.
Well, I went to Newhouse at
Okay.
Syracuse. I worked on newspapers
Oh,
for a bit before newspapers started to become more and more difficult to work on.
like we do now.
Yeah. But I have a love for newspapers. A lot of my friends are in the newspaper business. And then I had an opportunity to work for Tom Brokaw. And I went and worked for Tom Brokaw doing specials for a couple of years. I made the special called Gang Cops and Drugs with a bunch of other people. I was a junior member of that, associate producer, and the New Hollywood. And then, I took some time and trying to figure out what I was going to do. I made TV commercials and directed, all kinds of stuff, music videos for bands, rap bands, and for all kinds of bands, and concert videos. And then my partner came to me with the idea of doing a documentary about birthday party clowns, which ended up being capturing the Freedmans. So there you go.
So you sort of with Providence and Detroit, and now Youngstown, the Mahoning Valley. Why Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley? How did you come to learn about our history and about the corruption and the deeply rooted organized crime and all of that? Give us some insight into that. How did you come to know us?
Well, I probably knew you before I came there, honestly, because I grew up in a world like that to some extent. And I also had married into that world. I married a woman from Providence, Rhode Island, from Federal Hill. So, she was Italian. So there were uncles and aunts, and, I met Buddy Cianci and the mayor, and, and sort of, I noticed very quickly this sort of how a smaller city is corruptible in a ironic way. There's a lot of familial connections that happen, a lot of friendships that happen, and those things sort of transcend normal criminal relationships, and they're much more emotional. There's much more, at stake at some level. And so I knew that world to some extent. And when I read the David Grant article, I recognized it. And I recognized Trafficant as being sort of a transcendent character in this huge family of Youngstown, Ohio, So, it was a matter of coming here and seeing if there were going to be people who could talk first person about it, because all I do is first person narratives.
Right.
I feel like I'm taking people's voices and giving life to them. If I have to write in between and talk a little bit, that's fine. But I try never to comment on things, or at least not too much. You try to create a cinematic piece of storytelling with real people acting, in their own lives. And then
that's the most interesting part of the podcast. And as I listened, I also listened to the first 4 episodes, and my big question is, how did you get Dinzio to talk, and where did you find him?
Well, Emil's around. Can't really tell you where right now, but he's around. And he's done some stuff. He hasn't been totally off camera.
So he's written a book.
He wrote the book. Right. So, and I've always been very lucky that way, to be able to get people to sit down and talk about these things. And I had a good partner in that with Catherine, who's unfortunately not on the podcast. Yeah. But she's very, very good at, making people comfortable. But time is the biggest thing. That goes back to why podcasts, right? Having time with people where you're not like standing there with a camera or with a microphone, and you're just spending time with them. And letting them become acclimated to the temperature of the water you're swimming in, and that takes a little bit of time.
Yeah, when you're not telling them your deadline is tomorrow, so you're publishing with or without their comments,
So when you made the decision and I'm sure sat down with the team and whoever else to talk about, okay, the next Crooked City is going to be Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, the Mafia, Jim Traficant, as exemplified by that. You had some certain I'm sure, preconceived ideas about this region. Had you visited before? Had you ever come to the Valley prior to you beginning this this project?
No, but I've been to Cleveland. I have family in Ohio,
Oh, okay.
Columbus area, but I didn't know how deep the corruption and organized crime had its roots in the Valley. I figured it was like Providence, which is in Providence, it's kind of everywhere, but not everywhere. You know,
Right.
there's Federal Hill, of course, but then there's College Hill, and there's places where it doesn't, and there's sort of a Brahmin element to it that,
Sure.
you know, is balanced in some ways. But in Youngstown, I was very surprised to see it was kind of everywhere. You know, you couldn't really escape it in politics, in law enforcement, or in just daily life.
And so, the first time you visited,
Yeah.
tell us your impressions. Tell us, you know, I mean, what went through your mind and your emotional reaction when you first stepped foot in the Mahoning Valley.
Well, you were part of that, right? I think my first,
Right.
we went on that tour of the Vindicator. You see like the outline and of a great smaller city. You know, the architecture downtown, the building of the Vindicator's Inn, you know, you see it very clearly. And it's not just because of organized crime and political corruption that those things have been cast astray. There's a lot of reasons, those things. And we try to cover it in the podcast, or at least embedded in the podcast in a way people can understand it. But what you find is what you find in a lot of Midwestern cities. I just did Mind Over Murder for HBO, and that's out of Beatrice, Nebraska. And Beatrice is another city that, you know, their biggest employer left, Kool-Aid, and left the city high and dry, you know, and then it becomes a struggle to figure out what you're going to be next. You know, it's like graduating high school,
Right.
but 72 years old, and you're trying to figure out your new career, you know, and the city seemed to have stumbled. You know, you could see the cracks in the sidewalk.
Right. And so you began, you know, yeah, and we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that Mark Brown, the owner of the Youngstown Printing Company and formerly the general manager of the Youngstown Vindicator, his mother, Betty Brown Jagner, was the publisher. Mark gave you access to what we call the morgue, to our archives and the photo files and all of that. I would assume that those were very helpful because it sort of set.
I mean, unbelievable.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, Bertram, don't let him throw that stuff in the garbage, all right?
No, and then we realize how important that is.
And stop letting people in there to take photographs out of the photo archive. You know, I mean, you
I
gotta
told you
lock
that
that
story
stuff up.
about you know, when he
Yeah.
went through the envelopes, the photo envelopes.
Yeah.
There were a lot of pictures that were missing
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you know in the old days.
But what's extraordinary is the index card file.
Yes.
And I've seen that. You know, I worked in newspapers in the, you know, early 80s, you know, so I remember those index files. But the detail and the craftsmanship that went into creating something,
Right.
a record like that, you know.
Yeah, we had
I mean,
great
I'd love,
clerks.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to make a visual documentary about this, you know, at some level, and that would be a key to it, I think.
I'll chat.
No.
I'll chat with Mark about that, and maybe
Yeah.
he and you can talk. But I remember how when I showed Catherine, there were the index card files on editorials,
Yeah.
going back to the 1800s.
Yeah.
She couldn't believe it, you
Yeah.
know, because those days, you know, when they used to write editorials, we do summaries on those files.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that, you know, like when I became an editorial writer, that became my go-to to see what positions we had taken over the decades.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, especially when we were talking about organized crime and government corruption, it
Yeah.
provided a very complete picture, I believe. Yeah.
Yep. Well, you remember how Catherine and I sat there taking pictures
Yes.
of the index? I mean, I thought at one point we would be able to kind of recreate those in a weird way, kind of come up with like some way to weave them.
Right.
And we never got there, you know, but it felt like just reading them was important. You know, it was sort of important for us to see the little pieces of information between the big pieces of information. And that's what you get out of those index files, you know, little things that you're like, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
That makes sense now. you know, and then seeing some of the people like, I know Bob Hogan's still around.
Right.
But, you know, seeing pictures of them when they're young,
Yes.
you know, it's like, you're like, wow, that's what he looked like, you know?
Yeah.
They all looked young. They were young and they all looked mean. That was, you know, there was this look about them that you knew if you were walking down the street and you saw him, you crossed the street because you didn't want to bump into him for some reason.
Yep.
Well, not totally, because people in town, you know, as you found with your family in Providence, for people in town, they were their neighbors and people who helped them out, and you know, people in the front pews and in most of the Catholic churches in town. So but the pictures that we took when they were, you know, getting arrested or
in trial,
doing nefarious acts were not the same.
Yeah.
So when you began doing your research and began building this story of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, were you surprised by how deeply rooted this corruption was, and the mafia and public officials, elected officials? Did that surprise you as somebody who had done Providence, somebody who had been in Detroit, somebody who has done other sort of documentaries and podcasts along the same lines? Did it surprise you?
Yeah, as I was saying before, it was everywhere. Whereas, you know, I mean, people would say back in the 70s, Providence was wide open. It really was not wide open. There was a war going on between the state police and the city police, and some people were corrupt, some people weren't corrupt. And, you know, you had, you know, a whole side of town that just ignored the whole thing, right? In Youngstown, it just seemed it touched everybody in some fashion. You know, even people we interviewed that didn't end up in the podcast, you know, they were just normal people. They were touched by organized crime and corruption at some level. One of the stories that's not in there is one that Paul Gaines told me, which I thought was extraordinary. When Paul Gaines was making trouble when he was a policeman, he was running the union, and he was making trouble for, you know, the people in charge who were corrupt. He got his father's business, which was a machine shop, got visited by the union. And all of a sudden they were trying to unionize his father's machine shop out of blue. And he got like 7 employees in the machine. It almost put his father out of business, you know? And it's just an example of how even the smallest moves could have reverberations in the smallest of ways, which I didn't find as much in the other cities we did.
And so there are 2 main stories in that sort of go through the 15 episodes. The one is the Mafia and overall corruption, and the other one is Jim Traficant. And I find that fascinating because, and I know you guys went through my book and looked at all the columns I'd written about Jim Traficant, my love-hate relationship with the man. You know, people used to laugh because he's a big guy. I mean, I know you see pictures of him. He's very large and an ex-football player and all of that. And here I am, had been described as being diminutive, but I'm short and small. And he would sort of make it a point to grab me and bear hug me, just to make, you know,
it's all in there, Bertram.
Yeah,
you gotta just pay the binge price.
What's that? It's intimidation.
It's all in there. You gotta listen to it. It's
we will.
You're a very big part of it.
But you know, I found it ironic that the 4th episode is about Trafficant, sheriff, and his attack on the FBI. It's ironic that it was dropped on Monday, the very day that Donald Trump came out with a statement regarding the search of his Florida, and he took on the FBI in much the same way. And I thought, this guy's still channeling Jim Traficant. But I'm sure that when you were talking to people in this community about Jim Traficant, you didn't get the same kind of negative, you know, scummy picture that I and others in the media painted of this man, because I still get pushback from people about Jim Traficant, and a lot of his supporters are now Donald Trump supporters. So tell us about that when you were doing the Trafficant episodes.
You know, if you think deeply about trafficking, it's never black and white. You know, it's always a little bit of gray area in there. It's same with Buddy Cianci, same with Kwame Kilpatrick in Detroit. You know, there's a balance between good and bad, you know, and unfortunately these guys there's an internal corruption that's going on. And I always thought that, I came to think, just following his trajectory, that he was a product of Youngstown, that this is how it was done. And he was doing it the way it had always been done. The thing is, things had changed, you know, and he wasn't changing. He still had those relationships. He still depended on them at some level and fostered them and got something out of them as he went along in his fight with the FBI and his trying to, you know, get out from under all these investigations and all this scrutiny. He just became a worse example of himself and the corruption of Youngstown rather than a better example of himself. So ultimately, yeah, he did do a lot of good things for Youngstown. I think there are things you could point at that he did that were good. But if you pull the camera farther back, you see that he only continued to, you know, to represent this corruption and this element of organized crime. And even till the end, you know, he was using, you know, when he was being expelled from Congress and he was on trial for, you know, for corruption, and the trial that he finally lost, there's elements of that trial that he brought this witness on that had flipped from being somebody who said that in the beginning that he was trying to have her killed, and then later she becomes a witness. You know, that's very mob-like to me. I've been through these mob trials. They're very tricky in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. They're very tricky in the courtroom. And you see that with Trump too. He's very tricky. Yes. You know, trying to undermine, he's not really going after the evidence. They're trying to undermine the credibility of the authorities, you know, and that's something that you learn from the mob, from organized crime.
Dave Beatrice, meet Marc Smerling.
Hey, David.
So, hello. I don't see him.
You know, David, it's appropriate that you should be talking to us from a courtroom, because there are two kinds of people in the Mahoning Valley who are in court. A lot of public officials who've been arrested, and criminal defense lawyers like yourself who defend them. So welcome to the show.
I'm literally waiting on. I just finished a murder trial, so I'm waiting to finish. I'm waiting on a jury.
And we understand if you have to bail on us, that'll be okay. So David has watched all 15 episodes. David is a leading criminal defense lawyer.
16, and I binge listened to him. There's 16, Bertram. I'm just saying, not 15.
Whatever. What? Yeah. And David is a criminal defense lawyer, but he also served as chairman of the Mahoning County Democratic Party and was a special prosecutor in some of these cases. So, David, you wanted to talk to Marc. Go ahead. First, give him your impression.
Nice to meet you, David.
And then give him some of your own insight.
It's nice to meet you. You know, spot on.
Thank you.
I mean, you really caught the essence.
Yeah, I appreciate
of it. And the only thing you kind of missed, but it was systemic.
Yeah.
It was putrefied.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like normal for lawyers to get a fee and have nothing to do with the mob and go in with their friends who are prosecutors and share the fee and get a reduction.
Yeah. And
that was the sort of the milieu in which we found ourselves.
Yeah.
It was sad because we lost a generation to economic development, and we got a bad reputation, and we've never been able to fix it since. I mean, the FBI came in and they rooted it out. I mean, it's gone now. We got very honest elected officials now, but it was bad for a long time, bad. But what was funny, there was sort of a part of a story. So I was appointed a special prosecutor, and I was doing some public corruption unrelated to what the federal government was doing. And the FBI calls me and they say, "We have credible evidence someone wants to kill you." I go, "Okay, who?" They go, "We can't tell you that." I go, "Protect yourself." I said, Protect myself from what? Who wants to kill me? We can't tell you. Was it the dry cleaner? My next door neighbor? You know, I was a special prosecutor. Was it someone I was investigating? I didn't know. And it was someone that's one of the main characters in your story. So, I mean, it's weird, but
it's weird.
3 months later, I'm in the courthouse, and some lawyer comes up to me and goes, "Hey, Dave," you know, old gruffy lawyer. I go, "Yeah." He goes, "The FBI come up to you and tell you someone's trying to kill you?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "He's not trying to kill you anymore." I go, "Oh, you're safe now." I go, "Well, who was it?" He goes, "Frank Suzanne." I said, "Okay." I want to say 8-9 years go by, right? I'm at a bar. I see Frank Suzanne. I go up to him and I go, "Were you trying to kill me one time?" He goes, "Well, that's one way to look at it. I kind of look at it like I saved your life." I go, "You saved my life?" He goes, "Yeah, my other guy wanted to kill you, and we were stalking you, and we were going to do it at your office, but we were afraid of the cameras at the federal courthouse. And then we saw you sitting on your green chair in your family room, bouncing your son up and down, and now my heart's going into my stomach because he's describing my family room." And Frank says, "Can't we just put a bomb on his front porch and just scare him?" And then he goes, "You know, the guy got young kids. We really can't kill him." He goes, "We should let him go." Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He goes, "We should let him go." He says, "So actually, I saved your life." And we became the best of friends. The irony of that is beautiful. And he just caught a charge, I want to say 6 years ago. I represented him in federal court. And we were at a Halloween party, and he took a toy gun and he put it to my head. And we put it on the internet. And it was just funny. But when I was listening to Frank, it's just funny.
Yeah.
And
You know,
I really
illustration of what I
congratulate
was
you.
It was an illustration of what I was talking about before, which are
Yeah.
these relationships are so close. You know, friends become enemies,
Yeah.
enemies become friends. It's Shakespearean.
Right.
And I don't know whether that's a Mahoning Valley, Youngstown Mahoning Valley thing, or it occurs elsewhere. But I was, and as David's talking, David is a criminal defense lawyer, and his mentor was Don L. Hanai Jr., the chairman of the Democratic
boy.
Party for a long time, and
Very
who
weird
represented
stuff.
a lot of mobsters. In fact, he was Jimmy Prado's lawyer. He was the one who introduced me to Joey Naples, the mob boss. You know, he took me out to the Calamar to meet with Prado and have lunch there.
He was on 60 Minutes saying everyone's on the take.
Yeah,
You could dig up an old video of him on 60 Minutes saying
Right.
everybody here takes bribes. Yeah, as he was getting older in life and I was coming up, he took me under his wing and you know, he had a lot of good attributes. And I took all of the good and, you know, really made a good career out of being a lawyer, sort of learning under his tutelage. And then he taught me how to organize and do all of that. And I became the chairman. But what was funny is when I became the chairman in 2010, I was the chairman maybe a year, and I get called to the FBI office and they go, "So how much cash are you taking?" I'm like, "What?" I go, "Nothing. What are you guys talking about?" Like, I was the next generation. It had ended.
Yeah.
I wound up representing Champ Sadie in federal court. He was caught up in, you know, we had an engineer and judges, and he was a bag man for Jimmy Filomena. And I wound up representing him in federal court. We lost the case, but when I heard Judge O'Malley, man, did that bring back a host of memories of that case. I mean, that case was 3 weeks long, 4-day deliberation of the jury. It was a lot of fun.
But Mark,
I just congratulate you on, I mean, you just nailed it.
yeah, but Mark,
the only
I
part
have
of
to,
the story I don't think you picked up was the mob was doing their stuff on the side, but the system was so putrefied that everyone had deals going. I mean, everyone. It was just gross. And it's cleaned up now, but I wanted to congratulate you. I'm glad I got to talk to you.
But David,
I listened to the first one. Go ahead,
He can hear
Bertram.
us.
can you hear us?
I don't think so.
Hey, David, especially lawyers. The lawyers in this region
Was bad.
contributed mostly to the corruption of this region. And these are your friends, David. I hate to say this. These are people
Well,
that
they
you've
were a
worked
little
with
older
for a
than
long
me.
time.
I was a generation behind them. And I would like to have thought if I was a generation older, but they, honestly, their mindset was they weren't committing crimes. Like, hey, I made a great feed. Let me share it with you and reduce the case. And in their minds, it was so bad that they didn't think that was wrong. I mean, that is the way it just came. I mean, the mob was doing their stuff and then everyone was doing stuff.
Yeah.
It was
Hey,
bad.
Mark,
The system.
let me ask Mark a question. When you were in the Valley, when Catherine was in here, when Olivia came in, others came in, talking to people, at least from what I talked to Catherine and all, what they were surprised at was how many apologists there were in this region for not only mobsters, but corrupt government officials, corrupt lawyers, corrupt private sector people. Is that something that's unusual about us?
No, because, what happens is sort of a group mentality of the world is kind of against us. We're in this together. And, you get a lot of people who are like, well, it was better when the mob was around because at least, A, B, C, D, whatever their thing is, or things at least I could get a case fixed, or I could do this, or I could do that. It's much worse now because look what the federal government did to us. Look, we're like in terrible condition. The city's in terrible condition. All this cleaning up has not really helped anybody. That's the attitude. They don't see the bigger picture of it.
So how long did you all spend on this project?
Well, it went way beyond what we usually spend because of COVID. We had to shut down for a period of time because we started it pre-COVID. And then we didn't, for like a year, it was just Catherine and I trying to do the interviews as much as we could, and but not really gearing up because, it was difficult to get people to sit down for interviews or COVID, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But it usually takes about a year, takes about a month an episode if you're lucky. So a year and a half to do something like this.
So how much ended up on the cutting room floor?
Tons.
And
Tons.
could you do a part two of this continuing story?
Not really, because what you're doing is you're sort of distilling. It's like making whiskey. You're starting with a lot of corn, a lot of rye, and then eventually you get it down. I mean, since it's personal narratives, you've got to try to find the people who touch the story in multiple places along the way. Frank Susani, Emil, obviously,
right.
Mark Baccio. I mean, he's a guy who touches the story in several places. Paul, obviously. I did meet with Lenny Strollo before he died, and I thought we were going to get there talking to him. He was surprisingly jovial and fun to hang out with. He wasn't what you would think would be a mob boss. He wasn't gruff. He wasn't difficult. He made a lot of jokes.
That's what I meant earlier when I was talking about it. That's how these guys are to their neighbors, their families, their friends, and that's why they had such wide acceptance, because they have that dichotomy.
Yeah.
It was definitely incestuous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And my son enlisted in the Army. Why, I don't know. And he became an Army Ranger. And I was the chairman. And a thought went through my head. Would the president do something if I said something about him? And I said, man, the fact that I'm even thinking that, I resigned as chairman. I knew right then I was done.
Yeah.
But they took a run at me, and I said, I don't play ball. These little different factions that are left over. But, the FBI, thank God for them. I mean, they really, I don't know if Bertram told you, but it was like 80 people.
Yeah,
the engineer.
I went through all the files.
Oh my God, the engineer, they were fixing murder cases.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was gross. I couldn't believe it when I was listening to the tapes, because they had a lot of tapes, and the 301 reports. I go, oh my God, they're fixing murder cases. I mean, that's just gross.
Yeah.
I remember when they brought Jimmy Filomena in the courtroom, and he was in chains, and my heart broke for my area, because it was like, here's a representation of Mahoney County, and it's in chains. And it was very apropos in a way, but very sad for me to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was pervasive, right? There were a lot of sheriffs that, you know.
The sheriff, prosecutor, you know, judges, lawyers.
Multiple prosecutors, multiple judges, multiple law directors.
Yeah.
And business people. There were business people.
Oh, yeah.
But
business
you look at the
people
city now, and you can understand why people are nostalgic for the way it was.
Yeah.
And that's really what you're hearing when you're like, you know, when you're hearing people make excuses for the way it was, you're hearing the nostalgia.
Did you hear that in the other places that you did?
Yeah, Providence has that in a big way.
You did.
Yeah.
Because
Detroit, not so much.
You said you're from. Well, you worked in New York. Are you originally from New York?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the mob situation up there seemed to be the same in those kinds of neighborhoods where they were popular, you know, and
yeah. But New York had a lot more that they could depend on for income. You know, there are a lot of places the mob couldn't touch, even though if maybe they wanted to. You know, the trouble, as I said, the trouble with Youngstown is it seemed to get into every facet of government and public life. You know, it just was everywhere.
It was rotten to the core. It really was.
So,
and so much so that we've lost so much economic development over it. And our area really suffered. People, it's sad in a way, very sad.
Mark, I wonder, when the Vindicator, Youngstown Vindicator was publishing, and I used to write my Sunday columns, invariably I would get a call on Monday, or the publisher would get a call on Monday, or the general manager, Mark Brown, would get a call saying, why is he digging up ancient history? That's all in the past. That's not us anymore. You know, we're no longer the Rust Belt. We're no longer mob town. We're no longer, and he's doing this community a disservice. I heard that, and they heard that time and time again. Did you hear that when you were trying to do this?
I hear it every time I make something.
Did you?
Really?
Of course. I mean, you know, people who love the city don't want it to be seen that way anymore, and that's understandable. But the truth is, I mean, it's you got to embrace your history at some level to make real change, right?
Well, it's happening on the national level as well right now. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, you know, you have a wonderful university there. You know, there's hope to be had, and you know, it's a great, beautiful place to live. There's great architecture. There's great potential. It's just that, you know, how do you find your way back? And it takes years and years and years. And, you know, Providence had their universities. They had something there when the fabric mills left, which was very much like they had the universities, and they also had a very large Italian population. So there was this sort of inherited organized crime that went on. And when the FBI came and cleaned that up, you know, they were able to convert the city through young people, you know, who wanted to live there, you know, and wanted to stay there after going to those colleges and being a part of that community, and, you know, great Italian food and all the good stuff. Mm-hmm. So it does sort of start on a very local level to create a place where people want to be, you know, and then to grow it. And I think the university is the hopeful center of that idea.
And we got a great president in Jim Traficant, who's the former football coach at Ohio State. So he's the president of YSU. So he's doing some wonderful things up there. But what I was so impressed, where are you from?
New York. I'm a New Yorker.
I was super impressed how much you nailed it.
You know, people want to tell their story, you know, and you come to a certain time. It's always trying to find the story at an arm's length so that people are free to tell it in an emotional way, you know. So it's a little bit how you interview people, how you treat them in their interview. You know, a lot of honesty and truthfulness, you know. I'm glad you liked it. You'd love Providence.
Well, I got to get going. The court's calling me. It was nice.
All right, David.
Nice meeting you. Excellent work. and thank you.
Talk to you later, David.
Bye, David.
Mark, we should be wrapping up in not too, unless Cindy's got some other specifics.
I wonder, excuse me, if you have a favorite episode out of this series.
That's a really good question. You know, the story of Baccio and Suzanne is just kind of an amazing story. And it's not a big, sprawling, epic story like Trafficant, but the humanity in it is kind of insane. And the fact that Baccio and Frankie are so open about it and so clear and willing to talk about it in a very open way gives it a lot of life, you know, and they talk about it in a very first-person cinematic way. So you kind of feel like you're riding on their shoulder during all these events. You're not just like listening to somebody talk about it, you're in it, you know. I think those two, the one where they meet, which is unfortunate the way they meet, and the one where, you know, Baccio comes back later on. Yeah. It's a pretty amazing story.
Did you, and I haven't, I'm keeping them once a week as opposed to sitting and watching and listening to all. And I know you talked to Baccio, and I know you talked to Gaines.
His story is amazing too.
Yeah,
I mean,
did Baccio get into the Gaines thing?
Oh, everything.
And so
everything. Sisman, Gaines.
Did you talk about entering Gaines's kitchen and all of that? When he got into the house, you talked to the FBI. Well, I guess Baccio his glasses were broken, or he didn't have his glasses on. And there's a story that when he entered Gaines's house, he saw the coat rack, and he thought it was a person, and he said, "Oh, pardon me, sir," to the coat rack. And the FBI has that story. And I'm thinking, you know, but I'll tell you what, I used that shooting to talk about, yes, we've had organized crime for so long, but it's almost like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. In which other city that has organized crime would you have a contract killer go in, you know, to the target, shoot the target's lying down, and the gun does not fire again? I mean, you know, to me, I used to talk about, my God, we are so bad we can't even do organized crime right. And it just seems that, you know, while there are stories about the mafia and all of this here, I wonder when you've done other cities and you've done other things, how the mafia locally here compares to, you know, the crime families in New York or whatever. I mean, is there a way to?
Well, it seems like the rivalry between Pittsburgh and Cleveland put a different cast on it, particularly in the older days. It was much more violent than I mean, not that Providence wasn't violent,
right?
But it was fewer and farther between. But this thing you're talking about, the gang that didn't shoot straight, right. I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting with an FBI guy during an interview and he says, and then we arrested them all and it was the gang that didn't shoot straight. You know, it's sort of like, you know, there is a bumblingness to it. Nobody's really, it's not like The Godfather, you know, it's much more like, you know, it's much more, most of these grudges, they come from weird places. You know, most of these murders happen for reasons that you can't even guess, you know. Now, sometimes, you know, Lenny Strollo tells, you know, Bernie that he's got to get rid of Paul Gaines and this is a hit for hire. But a lot of it is like grudge stuff, you know, that's a little bit less elegant and romantic. And it's a little more stupid and ironic and unfortunate. You know, you get a lot of that. And certainly when Baccio talks about killing Larry Sisman, that's that. There's a lot of that in these mob hits, you know. So unfortunately,
you said you had talked to Lenny, and you know, as we had talked before, I tried to get the deathbed confession and he wouldn't give it to me. Yeah. But you know, you said Lenny was very pleasant and was. I've always, as much as I give credit to the FBI and the Justice Department and the U.S. attorneys in Cleveland for cleaning up the Mahoning Valley, I still hold a grudge against them for allowing Lenny to keep his blood money. You know, he became a snitch, and one of the most prominent mobster snitches in the country, you know, but he was allowed to keep all of his ill-gotten gains. And here is a man who, as you know, on the stand said, oh, murder is just business, when he was talking about the killing of Ernie Biandello. That, to me, I think was an insult to a lot of honest people in this community who believed that Lenny should have been punished much more than he was.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I understand that. I also understand that, you know, if you're making a deal with the devil for a greater good, maybe you just got to take that deal. You know, I mean, he's so good on the stand.
Yeah,
he is cast as
right.
a witness. I mean, you just believe everything he says. So he took down the entire corrupt political infrastructure and organized crime infrastructure in one fell swoop. So it was a trade I guess the FBI was willing to make, you know.
And talking to the FBI, and finally, you know, there's just a last question. In talking to the FBI, how do they feel when somebody like a Jim Traficant would go after them publicly in press conferences? There was one press conference in which Traficant by name talked about the FBI agents, Bob Crona and Larry Lynch, who were lead FBI agents on organized crime, and said, well, you know, organized crime has existed for so long in this community. It's because of these FBI agents, Crona and Lynch, and you know they're on the take because look at the silk suits they wear. And he said this on live, you know, in a live broadcast press conference. In talking to the agents, how do they feel about that kind of? Because I asked the question because of what's going on with the FBI now, and the attacks by Donald Trump and his supporters against the FBI. How they're human beings. So how did that make them feel?
I'm sure that they felt terrible about it when it happened. I mean, now they look back and they kind of chuckle, right? Because in retrospect, there's a comedy to it. You know, you remember the story about Beef Terlecki, right? And how Beef was a corrupt vice cop in Providence, and you know, and was jammed up a couple times on corruption charges, among other things. And then eventually, you know, did a affidavit against Croner that was presented by Trafficant in Congress, which is kind of, I wish I could have done that story. I mean, that's the one story I would have let. I mean, it's just so absurd.
Yes.
But it's very interesting that Trafficant decided to use Beef Terlecki as a sword against Croner. You know, I mean, it's just, it's a fatal choice in some ways, because basically you're embracing somebody who's completely corrupt, has been proven to be corrupt, and eventually these guys, no matter how much they try to get out from under the crimes they've committed, are going to fall. So as soon as he latches himself to that guy, he's on his way to the end. It's never. So I think that, you know, guys like Croner, they kind of learned it. They come to know that at some level, no matter how bad it gets, these guys are corrupt and they've latched themselves to other corrupt people and they're going to fall. It's just a matter of time.
I know that you're going to miss coming back to the Valley.
I'll be back soon.
I know you're going to miss doing this. But years from now, when you think back to this project, what will be your memories? What will be your fondest memories, and what will be the memories that will sort of make you still shake your head at night when you think about it?
That's interesting. I mean, first thing I would think is probably one of the best things I've ever done. You know, there's a couple of things I'm very proud of. This is one of them. And I guess, let me think. Oh, well, it's that probably, I remember going to, what is that bar called? It's at the end of the Royal Oak.
Royal Oak.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And meeting the brothers who own that are very entertaining men. But, you know, being in there at a time when it was crowded with college kids and there are people drinking and eating the barbecue and stuff, and noticing that Jim Traficant painting on the shelf behind the bar, and just thinking to myself, that is so appropriate at some level. He's just receding a little bit, but he's always there in this sort of like ironic way, you know?
Hovering.
And I could have walked around that that bar and been like, do you know who that is? Do you know? And 80% of the kids wouldn't know who that was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So hopefully for the city of Youngstown, this can be part of their history that they can embrace, but they can also let go of and move on.
Mark, before we go, there have been several tweets on your Twitter account calling for a movie of the podcast. Do you have any plans for that?
Somebody wants to make it, that'd be great.
Maybe.
We've had a couple film companies and directors interested who have called, and we'll see. I mean, it's always a challenge because more of a television series is I think what they're proposing. And it's a challenge to get one of those things out. There's so little space in the world for those, even though now we have streaming, there's thousands of tiles.
Yeah.
But there's still, you have to have somebody who can actually get it made. Just like people come to me for documentaries because they know I'll make it and I can get it made. We got to find somebody who's excited about the story and, excited about, hopefully has some sort of personal connection to it and is maybe from the area, who has a burning desire to make it.
Well, I just finished watching a while back The Offer about how The Godfather nearly didn't get made.
Right.
So, yeah, I get it.
I mean, this is a sidebar. Crimetown Providence was bought by FX for, and they were promising to make it. They were in, and I think what I felt there that they were going to do it. And then, Disney comes in, buys Fox and FX. Things change and you don't really know, so hopefully somebody will do it. I think it'd be a great show.
Yeah.
Well, all the best. Thank you for joining us, giving us the sort of backstory to this whole thing.
Bertram couldn't have done it without you.
Well, it was a pleasure working with you and with Catherine and Olivia. I sort of I'm glad the Youngstown Vindicator was able to provide some assistance and our archives came in useful.
Yeah, they sure did.
But
say hi to Mark for me. I'm going to get together with him at some point. I've been asking every time I come, but I know he's been going.
Yeah, and I'm sure he would also like to sit down and talk to you. And I told him we were having you on today, and so he said to say hello. But we'll be in touch. Much success in your future.
All right, you too, and be good.
Nice
meeting you.
Nice to meet you too, Mark.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We've come to the end of another compelling video podcast presented by the Scribbler Publishing Group. If you found today's broadcast interesting and informative, we would urge you to listen to Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio, if you aren't already doing so, and to purchase my book, No Holds Barred, that is available at Barnes & Noble in Boardman or can be ordered at www.scribblergroup.com. The book, edited by Cynthia Rickard and designed by Robert McFerrin, the former art director of the Youngstown Vindicator, contains 300 or so columns of the 1,600 plus I wrote during my 40 years with the newspaper. In addition to the Mafia and Trafficant, there's a chapter dedicated to public corruption. Cynthia and I once again thank Marc Smerling and David Beatrice for joining us and providing important insight into the history of the Mahoning Valley. The Scribbler Publishing Group video podcasts are streamed on our YouTube channel and Facebook page, WFMJ.com, and other digital platforms. Please like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell on our YouTube channel. Finally, our thanks to Andy Kunkel, who produced today's podcast and also served as the technical director. Andy is a member of the Triad Production Group, a division of 21 WFMJ. Thank you.